Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Education Now. We'll wait a little bit longer as folks are signing up and getting settled in. We are very happy that you are joining us for this program. So, folks, I am going to get us started. Again, welcome to Education Now. Happy fall to everybody. This is actually our first Education Now episode of the season. My name is Francesca Purcell, and I'm Senior Lecturer on Education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. All this year, we've been closely following the twists and turns of the very troubled rollout of the redesigned and simplified FAFSA form. The free application for federal student aid form is meant to be a gateway for prospective and current graduate and undergraduate students. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit today, and as well as the lessons we can learn from many of the challenges that students, families, and colleges have been facing with this new FAFSA. In fact, earlier this week, officials from the United States Government Accountability Office testified before a House subcommittee in regarding their investigation into the Education Department's rollout of the FAFSA. And I think it's fair to say that it wasn't pretty. So we're going to be getting into this in a moment, and I'd like to remind everybody that we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll also find closed caption access there. So let me get us started by welcoming our guests. So with us today, we have my colleague, Susan Dynarski. Sue is the Patricia Albers Graham Professor of Education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We also have Kevin Fudge. Kevin is a higher education financial expert and an alum of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Kevin has helped students and families plan and pay for college for over 25 years. And also with us, we have Jackie Moreno. Jackie is the Chief Service Officer for the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, which is the college access and financial aid agency for the state. So I want to thank you each for joining us and for having this conversation. So Sue, I want to turn to you to sort of start us off and set the stage. Just generally about the FAFSA, its importance, and why are we even focused on this? So start us off, please.
Sure. Thank you for having me. As Fran said, FAFSA is indeed the gateway to federal, state, and institutional aid in the U.S. If you want to get the needs tested Pell Grant, if you want to take out a loan, even if it's not a needs tested loan, you need to fill out the FAFSA. So it's the linchpin of basically the whole needs testing system in the U.S. And it's been around in some form. It was called it was the FAF when I was going to school, whatever that was then. But it's been around in some form for over 40 years. Right. And pretty much that entire time, advocates for students, including me, have been arguing, complaining that it's a lot more onerous than it needs to be. It is not, never was a model of user-centered design, I would say. It had repeated questions. It was up to 130 questions long at some point. It was longer than the typical tax form that especially a low-income family would fill out. And so there have been incremental improvements over the years, including the automatic porting of IRS data into the form. The Department of Education has generally been dragged kicking and screaming in these improvements. So when I first proposed that link between IRS and the FAFSA at a congressional hearing, I think nearly 20 years ago, I was told by federal lawyers, absolutely impossible, couldn't ever happen. And now it's part of the process. So, where we are now is that as the last act that Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, his last legislation he pushed through. He was the chair of the Senate Health, Education, and Labor Committee for many years. And simplifying the FAFSA was a big priority for him. And he basically made it the last thing he was going to do before he left office. And so legislation was passed, shortening it by about 2/3 or so. And then planning for it began. And it didn't work out very well at all. I will say that it is both tragic and ironic that an effort to make the process simpler and make aid available to more students led to the complete collapse of the system and a 10% drop in the filing rate of high school seniors this year. So that is a huge drop, and we spend lots of money on grants trying to get an increase anywhere like that, like of 1%, 2%. So 10% is just enormous. So I'm heartbroken. I'm one person who has worked on this topic along with many others for years, trying to make simplification happen, and that the implementation was botched is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, I think there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of folks who are equally heartbroken by something that had so much promise and hope attached to it and has had, in fact, the opposite impact, which everybody was so much hoping for. Jackie, let me turn to you now. You have been on the ground through the state of Illinois, working with the fallout of this rollout. Can you tell us about your experience, what's been going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly? So just start us off from that.
I will condense my rage into 5 minutes. We'll see how I do.
Fair enough.
So our agency, we're the College Access and Financial Aid Agency. So in addition to the extensive service that we provide, we also administer nearly $1 billion in need-based aid for students. So we're impacted by this on 2 levels. The area that I oversee is direct service to students and families and practitioners, and we're divided into systems and a service. So we speak data, but we speak data so that we can advocate for students and make sure that the voices of students are represented in places where decisions are made about them. I laughed yesterday when I read the report, and it said, 4 million of the 5 million calls went unanswered. And there were days that it felt like all 4 million came to us. And that was from families that were already in the process, right? People were calling because they were already at some point in completing the FAFSA. And for context, in Illinois, we're really lucky. We're a FAFSA mandate state. We invented FAFSA data matching, and we have a full-time year-round near-peer advising corps. So we have people on the ground who can help do this. But even with that, at the end of the 23-24 school year, our data told us that we had to reach 14,000 graduating seniors over the summer to achieve parity with the class of 2023. And we're not at 100% in a regular year. So just to achieve parity with the prior year, we had 14,000 students to reach over the summer, which, to put that in context, it's the end of the school year. Students are, to borrow a phrase from our friend and colleague, Mandy Savitz-Romer, students are in their educational home with their school counselor during the school year. And now here we are when they are basically being cast out into a diaspora. They're not connected to higher ed, and there's no one whose job it is to help them make that connection. The FAFSA isn't just, I know that it's the document that helps you determine if you can afford college or what you can afford, but it is also the mechanism by which students connect from secondary to post-secondary. So it has huge implications. So we were lucky enough to get funding from the department via ECMC. And we used that to throw everything we could think of to reaching these students over the summer. So we funded salary for school-based practitioners on 9-month contracts to come back and work over the summer to help us keep reaching these students. We funded trusted college access programs and community-based organizations to host workshops because many students are just turned off by the system. So that is an entry point that we had to pay attention to. We funded endless workshops, endless in-person workshops, virtual workshops, an extensive old-fashioned grassroots outreach campaign, and a traditional marketing campaign. So we did all of those things, and we made significant progress. So we still have about 3,000 students that we have to reach. Some of that, though, overlaps because some students, make the transition to community college at this time of year and they get picked up in that process. But we did make significant progress. But, I think it's easy and really important to complain, right? I think it's important to be negative about this experience, but I also think that there are positives that need to be highlighted and amplified. We could not ask for a better demonstration of how important it is as a nation for us to stop relying on pizza parties and raffles for the most important step in the college going process. The FAFSA is the pivotal step in that process, and it's always been adjacent to school, adjacent to college readiness. And this demonstrated that that's nonsense and it has to stop. FAFSA completion has to happen within a school setting, within the school day, and it needs resources. It can't be last minute dollars thrown out when things are going awry. It has to be defined, reliable resources. This year, an enormous federal system basically relied on the emotional labor of caring adults and tried to leverage guilt as a policy lever. That's not sustainable, and students need better than that. And I also know that there are states that suspended or rescinded their FAFSA mandates, and I get it. I absolutely understand that decision in the height of the chaos. However, as practitioners and policymakers, we need to acknowledge that an opt-in process will always be biased. An opt-in process always favors people on the right side of information asymmetry. It always favors students with generational experience with the higher education system, generational wealth, and an abundance of social capital. We have to have an opt-out policy so that we can avoid the bias in our system, the gatekeeper bias and the information asymmetry. And one last thing, I do think we need to keep an eye on this graduating class of 24. There are still significant numbers of students who have no plan. And as states, we need to keep looking at beta testing for 24, 25, and keep an eye on the students who are still disconnected from education and gainful employment. Great.
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie, for sharing all of that. Sounds like Illinois, it sounds to me, perhaps has been in the lead, or one of the more active states in trying to sort of make up for the losses that have incurred over the last several months around this debacle. So be interested to hear more about that. But let me turn over to Kevin.
I just say, imagine what we could have done with all that energy.
Exactly.
The progress that could have been made as opposed to avoiding a disaster or reducing the impact of a disaster. So.
Indeed. So, Kevin, why don't you talk to us from your perspective? What has this situation been like for you? What are you seeing in your work? And I think I'm like Jackie, where she, I thought, very positively thought about what can we learn from this moving forward. That would be helpful to hear from you around.
Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for that segue. I am an eternal optimist, so if my glass is 99% empty, I say it's 1% full. So let's just level set there. So thanks for that nice segue. Also, I would say I save my venom for the real bad actors out there. So those of you that might be familiar with my work, very much a subject matter expert in student loans. So going after usurious interest rates, private loan market, and all the flaws with that aspect of it. So the back end. On the front end, I think, again, just to set some perspective, taking a 30,000-foot view, part of the challenge, and I hope it comes out that there's evidence behind this theory, student loan repayment had a pause during the pandemic. In March 2020, it was paused until people re-entered repayment October 2023. At the same time, the FAFSA was being delayed and pushed back until December. So the influx of calls that would happen normally in any year, given people looking for help from the 1-800-433-3243 number to call about federal financial aid, was also the same number that people would call if they had issues with their student loans. So when you have 40 plus million borrowers re-entering repayment, it was just a disaster on so many levels. And it a lot of people could see this coming 5 miles away. My hope is that this year's, because of the year we had last year, even though the delay again is until December, my guess it's going to get pushed back again until January. Fingers crossed that it won't. We won't see the same volume of drop calls and unanswered calls. So there's that. I think also from my perspective, because a lot of my work is at the intersection of higher ed, K-12, and workforce development, it's college readiness and career readiness on parallel tracks. And so we want people to complete the FAFSA, because not only is it the gateway to federal aid, but also state aid, right? And we've seen, especially here in Massachusetts, the growth of different programs in state aid, which is essential for a lot of people to gain access to college. But from a career readiness standpoint, I think it's been really interesting to see how career-connected learning, work-based learning for 16 and 17-year-olds in modern youth apprenticeships and internships can help with their post-secondary education pathway, meaning if they are having meaningful work experiences and even invited by companies in certain jurisdictions to work, then the company itself helps the student with their transition to post-secondary education after a year or two of working. Now, that's obviously not a blanket solution for everybody, nor does it solve the problems of the FAFSA. But I think it's important to note that some of the drop can be attributed to the growth in some of these programs that are trying to marry and put on same track college and career readiness and not having them exist on separate tracks. I'll also say too that the vice president made an announcement yesterday about the importance of entry-level positions being accessible to people without a bachelor's degree. Currently, I think about 3 to 4% of companies nationwide have done that, have eliminated bachelor's degrees for certain entry-level positions. So there's a lot of movement in this pathway development on how do we help people get into family-sustaining wage careers that have opportunity for economic growth without the barrier that has been the bachelor's degree, which in a lot of instances, according to some evidence, is more of a sorting tool than a credential. So what I'd like to see is a push to, again, have more people, as many people as we can, get into college, while at the same time simultaneously working on a lot of these efforts that encourage early entry in the workforce, early entry into career-connected learning opportunities to further clarify why people are going to college in the first place.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Let me take a beat to see if Sue or Jackie want to comment on anything you've heard, and if not, we have a few questions coming in.
Well, I want to make a rant. Can I make a rant?
Yeah, go ahead. Of course you can make a rant. So,
one thing I think this episode showed is just how delicate this system is, that so many millions of college students and colleges rely on for their survival. And honestly, I and many others have proposed that we get rid of the FAFSA altogether and just use tax data to determine somebody's eligibility and tell them years before they're of college age that you're eligible for this size of a Pell Grant based on your family size and your income, to make it automatic for people who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. We did such a thing in Michigan. Among low-income students, University of Michigan offered low-income students who were FERPL eligible, guarantee 4 years of free tuition and fees, tripled application rates, right? So this system that we're using to pick out exactly who should be eligible for exactly how much is made up of chewing gum and baling wire. And we could just, with a bit of rough justice, get rid of it and assign aid based on all of the information that we gather from low-income folks during their entire lives. We means test people constantly in the US. And there's strong evidence that that means testing process discourages, this is what Jackie was referring to, discourages from getting aid the people who most need it. Okay, rant over for now.
Okay, that's fine. I won't hold you to no more ranting. So one of the questions we had come in, I think it's a really important question, is that, and let me sort of start off by saying, we know in this country that many of our institutions, there's been a loss of confidence in them, including our colleges and universities, including all branches of our government. And this situation has very likely continued to undermine public trust in higher education and in the aid system. What is your best advice on how we can help rebuild trust in the aid system? And what should be the involvement of those outside of the government, particularly outside of the federal government, in helping rebuild trust?
I think
Jackie. Yeah.
I think that's important. It was, back when we had paper FAFSAs, and we have to separate our talking to the system and our talking to the public. Back in the days of paper FAFSAs, people liked to stretch the whole form out with all of the instructions and say that it was easier to apply for an offshore loan for your oil rig or something like that. But what it conveyed is that this is a very complicated, difficult process. And it was a deterrent. That visual was a deterrent for students who really, even if they had complicated situations, we knew that they were going to be an automatic 0 EFC. And so it was going to be a very quick process. So I think as we talk about this, we need to keep ranting, but we need to rant in certain circles and not rant in more public facing circles, right? Don't rant on the news necessarily. But that is that's one of the reasons that we invested so much effort in grassroots community outreach, because we needed somebody besides education to be a proxy for our message, someone that students trusted. We did work with churches and other community-based organizations, and I think that will be the key to it. And I think, peers and getting the stories of people in the process and recent college graduates can play a very important role, getting recent graduates to talk to students and families.
I think it's colleges themselves. I mean, at the risk of being the skunk at the picnic, higher education is a business. And in a lot of ways, it needs to operate less like a business and more like a public good versus a private good. 100 colleges in the country usually dominate the conversation about higher ed, particularly highly selective universities, name brands here on the East Coast. 70% of people go to public colleges across the country. And, from my experience in boots on the ground and listening and working with families, there is the biggest frustration is not knowing how much it's going to cost. A lot of the conversation about free college is very straightforward and clear, right? A lot of the initiatives that are working to say, hey, if there's free 2-year college for all the people that have some college but didn't complete the degree, we have these programs, come back, you can complete your degree for free, great. That runs into some behavioral economics where people think if it costs nothing, then therefore it must not be good. And then obviously the business aspect of college is raising their price from consultants who come in to say, if you raise your price, you'll appear to be more prestigious. Bottom line is, you could have, when I give talks to people, there's 100 people in the room, they could all apply to the same college and they're all going to pay something different. So that erodes trust in the institution, and it also causes it and calls into question the value, the proposition, like what am I getting? What's the return on this investment that I'm about to make? And particularly with low and middle income families who might see peers who have already gone on to college but have debt and no degree, or they have a degree but have debt that they're having difficulty repaying. They see that, well, wait, I would have been better off had I not gone in the first place, because yes, I have this degree, but now I have this debt and I'm making these payments that are not sustainable. So greater cost transparency, greater clarity on what we mean by free, and then greater transparency and conversation about how looking at the reward versus the risk and articulating what the investment will yield.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Go ahead. Sue, were you going to jump in on something?
Yeah, I just want to, part of what we haven't talked about why there was a meltdown, in part it was because Department of Education has been starved of resources for many years. Its GAO made clear that even conditional on the level of resources, very bad decisions were made. So it's not just about the amount of money. But you don't get more resources by keeping problems quiet. So I don't think there's any way that we can advocate for getting more money, for example, to the Department of Education or simplifying the process by quietly making a point on the side. So I think it's pretty hard to avoid the process of saying this is wrong in order to get it made right.
Yeah, and I think to that point, though, I think maybe more what I interpreted Jacqueline saying is that the conversation can be frustrating when people are like, well, college isn't worth it. And there are many advocates in the space that are now trying to make that argument that you're better off just because of the complexity and the challenges that, well, college isn't worth it. And we don't want to feed that narrative that college it is indeed worth it. Yes, some of these things can be onerous and cumbersome. We're working to simplify them. And it's like kind of short-term pain, long-term gain, short-term pain, long-term gain. Like eventually the system will get to a place where it's functional and works. But to the point about diminishing resources, I was actually making this point earlier today. It's challenging when you have leadership in the Oval Office that cuts resources or puts in place people in the Department of Education that lack the competency to make it run efficiently, right? So you can have 8 years where it's running at like 80% capacity, but then there's an administration change and then somebody comes in with zero experience and then runs it into 10%. And so the next administration is trying to get it back up to 50%. And so we have these ebbs and flows. And meanwhile, people, the general public, is along for the roller coaster ride. And so, yes, even though these things are happening, we still have to maintain that positive outlook so that the narrative doesn't get too negative and people are just like, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going to even bother.
So how come this doesn't happen to the Social Security Administration? Like when new administrations come in, we don't see Social Security fall apart and checks not arrive. So it's something about the priority that's placed on aid.
Right. Well, that's political science 101, though. That's like a voting block that everybody wants to get, right? So poli-sci 101, right? I mean, if college students voted in larger numbers than senior citizens, then maybe we'd see a change. But we only have a half hour to chop it up. So that's another topic for another day.
Well, listen, we have 2 minutes left. So what I'd love to do is to hear from each of you. Let's say a year from now, we get back together. What is your hope of what this conversation would be like in a year from now? Yeah, not Sally, but what is your hope? Go ahead, Sue.
Hopefully it'll be boring, uninteresting, because everything's running as it should. This should not be a topic for discussion. Is the functioning of the FAFSA. So
and if the simplification of the FAFSA rolls out in a way that it was meant to get the results that we're hoping for, what would that look like?
Well, I mean, to make the sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I saw a question about what people can do now. I always like to give people practical advice. It was the last question in the chat. So I think it's important to sort of like figure out, well, what is the reason to take a step back and to look at your reasons for wanting to go in particular, but then also having those conversations about what's the most sound way to make that investment. I know for a lot of people around the country, starting at a 2-year school, transferring to a 4-year school is a way to look at cost savings, cost effectiveness. And just, I would encourage people not to go on Facebook and look at message boards and hearing people complain about how bad the system is, and to go to trusted, neutral third-party sites. FAFSAday.org. We have one in Massachusetts. I heard Jacqueline mention they had one in Illinois. There are plenty of free resources out there and nonprofit organizations that are devoted to helping people make sense of this in clear, simple language. So that would be my advice. And then take your time. You can don't have to do the FAFSA in one sitting. You can save it, come back to it, and really have conversations with your students about what their goals or objectives are for college and beyond, because you can start to help them build that social capital in the summers, in times when they're not in college, so that they can really maximize their experience.
All right, and Jackie, I'm going to give you the last word. So,
all right. I'd like to say that if we're sitting here in a year, I'd like to be able to say that we were successful in doing two important things. One, using all of our political power in the policy world to put the pressure where it needs to be put without using an 18-year-old student as our political pinball, right? We're not going to make change by scaring, Susie, who's 17, into opting out of higher ed. So I'd like to say, if we learn from all of this and make big improvements to the system next year and get closer to a higher FAFSA completion rate and closer to FAFSA completion happening in a school setting.
Great. Well, I want to thank each of you for being here and for sharing your insights and for all of the work you've done and that I'm sure you'll continue to do. So thank you. And folks, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your days.
Mm.